Okay, so picture this for a second. You're in the Himalayas, right? Like crisp mountain air, beautiful scenery, and you're listening to the Chief Justice of India speak.
Sounds peaceful.
Right. But it's not just any speaking engagement. It's at a brand new law school in Bhutan.
Interesting. What's the Chief Justice of India doing giving a speech in Bhutan?
That's the thing. This speech, it gets into something that I think is really relevant to all of us, regardless of where we live.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the topic?
Public trust in the judicial system.
Okay, I see it. I mean, that's a big one, right?
Huge. And the speech, it actually digs into how India and Bhutan are trying to make their courts more open, more transparent, more accessible to everyday people.
So it's a comparative deep dive then, looking at how these two countries are tackling a pretty universal challenge.
Exactly. And what I found really fascinating was how the Chief Justice kept coming back to this idea of the public trust doctrine.
Now, that's an interesting one, especially when you're talking about the courts, because unlike other branches of government, they don't really have the same tools for building trust, do they?
You're right. They can't exactly run on campaign promises or offer tax breaks.
Ah,
So how do they do it?
exactly. And that's where this historical context comes in. See, the Chief Justice, he talks about how India, moving away from these colonial structures to becoming an independent nation, they had this uphill battle.
Making the courts feel relevant to everyday people.
Exactly, making them relatable, accessible, getting rid of that feeling of, them versus us.
Yeah.
And a big part of that was how the Indian Supreme Court kind of had to reinvent itself.
Become more of a people's court.
Yes, and they took some pretty radical steps to get there. One of the big ones was relaxing those procedural requirements.
Oh, you mean all that red tape that makes the legal system so daunting for the average person?
Exactly. Like, imagine this, the Indian Supreme Court said, in some cases, even just a letter could be considered a petition.
Wow, really? A simple letter. So no need for expensive lawyers or mountains of paperwork.
Precisely. It was about making the courts more approachable, less intimidating. And it wasn't just about simplifying the process either. It was about changing who the courts were there to serve. That's where this idea of public interest litigation comes in.
I've heard that term before, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on what it actually means in practice.
Of course. So basically, with public interest litigation, a case isn't just about those two parties involved. It's about issues that impact a whole community, systemic problems.
So things like, say, workers' rights or environmental protection, issues that might not have a single clear-cut plaintiff.
Exactly. It's about looking at the bigger picture. And this allowed the Indian Supreme Court to start tackling these bigger issues, especially those affecting vulnerable groups.
I can see how that would build trust, showing that the courts are there to protect everyone, not just those who can afford a legal battle.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, the Chief Justice, he tells this really compelling story about a young Dalit student who's facing this, massive fee issue.
Oh, something that could derail his whole education.
Exactly. And the Chief Justice, he uses the court's power to step in and make things right for the student.
That's so powerful. It really shows how these, what do you call smaller cases, they can have such a huge ripple effect, right? It demonstrates that the courts are listening and willing to act on behalf of even the most ordinary citizen.
Absolutely. It brings that human element back into the picture.
It really drives home the point that justice should be for everyone, right? Not just for the privileged few who can navigate the system or afford a high-priced lawyer.
Yeah.
But India, it's a massive country. So even with those simplified procedures, how do they actually reach people, especially those in remote areas or those facing other barriers?
Well, that's where India has been really ahead of the curve, actually, especially in their use of technology. In fact, the Chief Justice spends a good chunk of the speech talking about their use of e-filing.
Okay, so streamlining the process digitally.
Right. And digital case management systems.
Makes sense. So keeping track of everything electronically.
Yeah, and get this, he even talks about using WhatsApp to give people case updates.
Wow, WhatsApp. That's
Yeah.
thinking outside the box, for
Yeah.
sure. Using a tool that so many people are already so familiar with.
Absolutely.
I mean, I guess it makes it a lot less intimidating for people, right?
Yeah.
But I can also see how bridging the digital divide in a country as diverse as India could be its own challenge.
Oh, absolutely. And the Chief Justice, he addresses that head on. He talks about their commitment to using free and open source software for all their systems.
Which means they're not reliant on some expensive proprietary software. Yeah,
Exactly. So it's about making the technology itself more accessible.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But what about the people who maybe don't have regular internet access.
Yeah.
How do they factor into all of this?
So they've thought of that too. He talks about these e-service centers. They have them in physical courthouses.
Okay, so even if you live in, say, a rural village miles from the nearest internet cafe, you can still go to your local courthouse and get help with things like e-filing.
Exactly. It's about making sure that everyone benefits from these technological advancements, not just, the urban tech-savvy population.
It sounds like they've really thought about these issues really holistically, and it's not just about, accessing information, it's also about participation.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that the Chief Justice was really enthusiastic about was the impact of virtual courts.
Yes.
He actually spoke quite a bit about how they've been particularly beneficial for women in the legal profession. What was your take on that part?
I found it really interesting how he connected the rise of virtual hearings with, breaking down geographical barriers, but also how it sort of helps address some of the social constraints that women in India often face.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, like, that flexibility of virtual courts, it allows women to, manage childcare, other family responsibilities, and still fully participate in their careers.
Right, so it's not about having to choose between work and family. It's about being able to do both effectively. And I love that anecdote he shared about the child interrupting a virtual court hearing.
Oh, yes.
It just felt very relatable, very human.
It did. It did. And he uses that anecdote, I think, to really highlight how these technologies are changing the whole dynamic of the legal profession,
Yeah.
creating a more inclusive and understanding environment.
Yeah.
But what I thought was really fascinating is how he then contrasts India's approach with Bhutan's.
Oh, right, because Bhutan, they've taken a very different tack, haven't they?
Right. So while India is really leaning into technology, Bhutan is emphasizing more traditional methods of dispute resolution, like mediation.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's almost like two sides of the same coin when it comes to building trust and making the justice system more accessible.
Yeah. And they've actually had some really remarkable success with it. Like the Chief Justice, he talks about their recent National Mediation Week.
Oh, yeah, where they were able to resolve a significant number of cases outside of, the traditional court setting.
Exactly. And what I found really striking was the types of cases they were focusing on: family disputes, inheritance issues, even things like disagreements over property lines, issues that often get really fraught because of the emotional elements involved.
Right, those really personal disputes that hit close to home for so many people.
Exactly. And so by using mediation, they're encouraging a less adversarial approach, right? A less intimidating way of dealing with these sensitive situations. It shifts the focus from winning and losing to actually finding solutions that work for everyone involved.
It does create this sense of, working together to find common ground rather than two sides battling it out in a courtroom.
Exactly. And I think it really speaks to that idea that, even when we're talking about different approaches, both India and Bhutan are recognizing this key element of transparency when it comes to building trust.
And the Chief Justice, he actually made that point really explicitly when he said, and I'm quoting here, "Sunshine is the best disinfectant."
It's true, though, isn't it? Bringing things out into the open, making them transparent, it's often the best way to build trust.
Absolutely. And he then goes on to give these great examples of how India is doing exactly that, like their decision to start live streaming court proceedings for major constitutional cases.
It's amazing, right? So anyone with an internet connection can basically sit in on these court cases, see how the process works in real time.
Exactly. No more hiding behind closed doors, right? It's about demystifying the process and letting citizens see how their justice system actually operates.
Absolutely.
But I do wonder, about those who might not have access to technology or who might struggle with the complexities of legal language. How do they factor into all of this?
That's another area where India has made some really interesting moves. Like the Chief Justice talked about their efforts to translate court judgments into different regional languages.
Oh, wow. Okay, so making those decisions accessible to people who might not speak the dominant language.
Exactly. Because it's one thing to make information available, it's another to make sure people can actually understand it, right?
Right, it's about meeting people where they are.
Exactly. And they've even created these free online databases where they house all these translated judgments along with, other legal resources.
So it's like they're taking something that's traditionally been, well, kind of shrouded in secrecy, and they're making it open and accessible to everyone.
Right. And I think that's where you see that common thread between India and Bhutan, even though they're taking different paths. Both countries really seem to understand that an informed public is key to a healthy, functioning justice system.
It's true. And it's so encouraging to see these two nations, each with their own unique challenges and cultural contexts, really trying to tackle this issue head on, trying to make justice more accessible, more transparent, more trustworthy. But it does make you wonder, I mean, is it working? Are we starting to see a real shift in how judicial systems operate, not just in India and Bhutan, but globally?
Well, I think the Chief Justice would say yes. He seemed particularly optimistic about the impact these changes are having on the next generation of legal professionals. He sees this new generation of lawyers and judges emerging who are not only tech savvy, but who are deeply committed to using the law to make a real difference.
Right, so it's not just about upholding the letter of the law, but also about upholding its spirit, right? That idea of justice for all.
Exactly. And I think that's what he envisions for the future, this idea that the law shouldn't be seen as this intimidating force, but as a tool for empowerment, that justice should be something that everyone feels they have access to, not just a select few.
And that's a future we can all get behind, right? So, as we wrap up here, what would you say is the key takeaway for our listeners? What can we learn from the experiences of India and Bhutan?
I think the big takeaway here is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, right? But what both of these countries highlight is that building a more just and equitable society, it takes a multifaceted approach. It takes adapting to the changing needs of citizens, embracing new technologies, simplifying processes, and I think maybe most importantly, never losing sight of that human element.
Right, because at the end of the day, justice is about people. It's about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background or their circumstances, has an equal opportunity to have their voice heard and to seek fairness under the law. And that's a goal worth striving for, no matter where you are in the world.
I couldn't agree more.